Hello and welcome back to the Sino Bubble podcast. I know that the setup today is very weird. There are builders in my house, everything is upside down, there are wardrobes behind me. I also realised at some point that I'm going to have to hold my microphone. We're going to make it work. I'm going to continue to try and make the process as smooth as possible. We'll see how we go. Today's episode is about China's education system by popular demand. If you don't know already, I usually do a poll on YouTube when I'm deciding what the next episode is going to be. So make sure you check out the YouTube page as well if you want to take part in voting for the next episode. So the reason I wanted to do this episode wasn't because I have some sort of interest in general in China's education system, but I had read this article from Sixth Tone that was basically about mothers who give up their careers, their friendships, and just their entire lives basically in order to make sure that their kids do well in school. And I was like, oh, that's kind of crazy. That's not something that I personally would ever have to consider because our education system isn't so intense and, we have other options. I wanted to kind of look into more like the pressurized aspects of China's education system. It's not that unique. There are lots of countries that have really competitive education systems, but I just wanted to take a look at what exactly is going on in China, what's the effect on families, what's the government trying to do about it, and sort of what is, what's going on in China's education system. So I don't want to put too much emphasis on how schools are run. We'll briefly touch on that, but I want to talk more about kind of the issues that are going on. This is going to be divided into at least 2 episodes, potentially 3. So this episode is going to be dealing with early education, so primary school, middle school, a little bit of high school here and there. And then the next episode is going to be touching on university and kind of job prospects, higher education. And then if necessary, we'll do an episode on vocational school as well if the first 2 get a good response and go well. So like I said, we'll start with a little bit of structure first. So in China, you have 9 years of compulsory education between the ages of roughly 6 or 7 and 16 or 17. So you have kind of like an American style system. So you have primary school, junior, high school. I'm not sure how you would term it in America, but essentially like a middle school followed by a high school and then tertiary education. Something that's going to be important for this episode is the fact that in middle school, you take a test to get in, and that test determines whether you go down the mainstream education route or the vocational route. It's a very, very important test, and that's going to be a recurring theme in this episode. So we have spoken in previous episodes when we were talking about 20th century China about the education system. It's very different to how it was in the imperial times and in Maoist China. Now it's a lot more modern, but there are still some legacies that we should consider when talking about China's modern education system. Certain things like rote learning is still one of the most common teaching methods. It depends on where you are, but you tend to have relatively large class sizes in China, and it's just kind of easier that way, I suppose, but also that's just how it's been done, even since imperial times. Children are tested constantly on every single subject that they take. At the end of each term, you will have at least one test, and you will usually get tested during term time as well. And then you are ranked against other students in your class. So you always know your position in your class based on the sort of aggregated score of all of your tests. That's also a legacy from the imperial system, because obviously when you take the imperial exam, you get ranked amongst all the other candidates, and then that decides your sort of job prospects or whether you can move on to the next stage of the exam. So like I said, it's very typical for, I suppose, developing countries to have similarly pressurized education systems, especially when the government is keen for them to catch up with other economies. South Korea's education system is very similar to China's. Again, not unusual because they have similar Confucian backgrounds, but if you guys have seen the movie Parasite, the first scene is actually the main young man and his friend has gone to university and he hasn't, and that's sort of like the framing of the entire movie. It's like there's immediately a class divide between people who can get into university and people who don't go to university. That shows how central and important education is to South Korea's economic and sort of like class system. In China, it's slightly different. China isn't as advanced an economy as South Korea, but in trying to advance, that's where education becomes so important and is becoming very highly pressurized for children and their families. So when I taught in a school in China, this is not going to be the case everywhere, but when I taught in a school, it wasn't unusual for children to live on the campus during the week, so Monday to Friday. They would do everything on campus, like eat, sleep, study, see their friends or whatever. The day usually starts at like 6 a.m. with the national anthem. It's a tune that I will never be able to erase from my memory. And, you know, they get up, they have breakfast, they get ready for the day. They start studying around, say, 7:30. A lot of them, that's like pre-class study. Then you have classes all day from 8 till 3-ish. You've got your lunch and your dinner. You have breaks, but I never saw anyone playing during their breaks. They were all like either sitting and studying or, you know, just hanging out with their friends. But there was very little play. I taught at a middle school. So this is like year 7 to year 9, or 11-year-olds to 14-year-olds, that kind of age. And then after school, you also have another study session as well. So you're expected to study till around, I'd say 10 p.m.-ish, and then it sort of lights out and you go to bed by 10:30. But yeah, that kind of shows you that the day is structured around studying in a Chinese school. There's little space for sort of social connections, for extracurriculars or anything like that, especially because I taught in kind of not a rural school, but like it was like semi-rural, so it was outside of the big city in a suburban town. So these kids would have had less opportunities than the children who studied in Chengdu city. I was outside of the city. So these were kind of like kids from poorer working class families as well. And yeah, it was intense. The teachers are also under a lot of pressure in China as well. A lot of them have sort of WhatsApp style groups with the parents where the parents can ask questions. They can give the parents updates as well. So the teachers are kind of constantly being monitored by the families, as well as, you know, having to stay on top of the kids, constantly be grading them. Yeah, it's a lot. So something that's interesting about China's educational development at the moment is that the number of primary and like middle schools is decreasing, but the number of teachers is increasing. It's more like schools are being consolidated into one another, if that makes sense. So like under-resourced schools are being closed down, but primary education is becoming better resourced. There are more and more teachers entering that field. And that's kind of a reflection of the fact that that stage of education, so from the age of like 7 onwards, is becoming more and more competitive. So you've probably heard of the Gaokao before. The Gaokao is a yearly standardized exam that every high school student takes to get into university in China. However, there's another exam called the Zhongkao, and that's the middle school exam, and that basically decides whether you're going to get into middle school or go down the vocational route. So now there is more focus from a lot of families on the Zhongkao as opposed to the Gaokao. Like the Gaokao comes later, you got to get into middle school first. It should come as no surprise that there is an urban-rural divide when it comes to education. There's also a regional divide as well. We won't talk so much about the regional divide. We might talk about it more when it comes to higher education because it's more evident, I think, in the Gaokao. Where the differences lie in early years is in that urban-rural divide. Who has the resources for primary education and who doesn't. So I want to talk about the Zhongkao, but first I want to talk about private tuition in China, because I feel like this really shows how the class divide affects education. What does the private education sector in China look like? Shadow education, referring to private supplementary tutoring alongside regular schooling, is increasingly demanded by students who have higher expectations for educational attainment and those who have less satisfactory academic performance in schools, as well as well-performing students. Apart from the increasing demand of private tutoring for academic subjects and preparation for exams, private tutoring and institutions for cultivating interests and hobbies, training of other skills such as musical instruments, and participation in other extracurricular activities are also highly popular among parents who wish their children to have a well-rounded development. The reason I pulled up that quote is because it highlights the fact that private tutoring isn't just like an extra thing. It's something that's for everyone. It's for well-performing students. It's for students who are underperforming, people who are kind of in the middle, people who want to do extracurriculars, people who just need core subject help. It sits like a layer on top of the regular education system. So it's almost something that you have to do. If you opt out of it, a lot of parents worry that your child will fall behind. We're going to discuss that more. So the private tuition industry in China is really huge. It usually consists of, like an office building where kids go after their school classes and take lessons with qualified teachers. Things like, people who are qualified in maths, who have a master's in English, lots of foreign tutors go there as well, so like native English speakers to help children with their English courses and things like that. So in terms of the industry size, from 2017 to 2019, the private tuition market grew from 500 billion yuan, so that's $78 billion, to more than 800 billion yuan, or $124 billion. And the online education market was around 40 billion US dollars in 2020. So this is a really huge market. It employs a lot of people, including teachers who teach at regular school and then earn extra money teaching at these sort of after school projects. Despite both its educational value and its monetary value, the private tuition market in China is very, very controversial. It's one of those things where it's like, because it's undermining the meritocracy of the system, people don't like it at face value. But because everybody feels like they need it, otherwise their own child is going to fall behind, no one really comes out and fully condemns it or stops using it. Even the government that has tried to crack down on it hasn't been fully successful in actually getting rid of it. So Xi Jinping's government has sought to reduce the advantage of money in a fiercely competitive educational environment where top university degrees can be crucial to entering high-paying industries. The so-called double reduction policy in China has aimed since 2021 to limit homework and after-school tutoring, and makes it illegal to teach core curriculum subjects such as Chinese, English, and maths outside of school for profit. So this double reduction policy was actually expanded in 2022 as well. 12 government departments led by the Ministry of Education published a new guideline targeting underground tutoring activities and pledging to stamp out the trend by 2024. The plan aims to set up a basic mechanism to prevent, locate, and punish offenders. The double reduction policy sent shockwaves through the $300 billion industry, leaving household names in education spinning and sending tens of thousands of people out of work. Although authorities initially claimed that the policy was working, it's led to a large number of tutoring firms offering classes secretly, with as many as 3,000 of them providing illegal academic training during 2022. The new regulation also urged local officials to curb illegal academic tutoring hidden in venues such as residential compounds, commercial buildings, hotels, and cafes through community management. Additionally, the ministry also called for supervision of online job websites to be strengthened and job ads referring to after-school tutoring to be banned. Authorities have asked schools to discourage students and parents from supporting private tutoring activities, calling upon them to instill correct educational values. But parents who were already anxious over the closure of private classes said they're still willing to pay for such services, even if they're illegal. The policy hasn't made us less anxious about our kids' education. It's not about wanting them to be the best, it's more about the fact that we feel incapable of teaching our children and need more professional support. So as you can see from that argument, people are so desperate to have that extra support with education that it doesn't even matter if the practice is illegal, they're still willing to contribute to this sort of black market of education, which is such a weird thing to have a black market in. If anything, it exposes the fact that the current education system isn't doing enough in whatever sense, and like the actual system needs to be fixed. Otherwise you wouldn't have these illegal activities popping up, right? It hasn't stopped these people from making a lot of money and for people being able to just go to China and be immediately successful. So let's take a look at some of the people who actually work in the industry. With a contact book full of teachers and parents desperate to give their children the best opportunities, tutoring broker Elaine is doing a roaring trade, even in the face of repeated closures, fines, and a persistent government crackdown. 2 years after the government first squeezed for-profit education companies, business is growing very quickly, said Elaine. We've been reported several times, the authorities were tipped off, but punishment was very light. More and more parents realize that after-class training and tutoring still exist, and that their children will fall behind if they don't use it. For middle-class people, they found solutions, very local solutions that are invisible to anyone from the outside, said Julian Fisher, co-founder of Venture Education, a Beijing-based market intelligence consultancy. Tutoring services are usually coordinated through WeChat groups, China's main social media platform, while tutors often teach students directly in their homes or work in centers that may disguise their teaching in the event of an inspection. The demand is crazy, said one English language teacher in Shanghai, saying that he earns around $56 an hour from tutoring, and that the practice usually just kind of spreads whenever he visits a student at home. The owner of one tutoring institution in the wealthy eastern city of Hangzhou said teachers sometimes rented out different training venues to avoid detection. Online classes are also popular. Such is the secrecy surrounding tutoring that Fisher cited the example of a high-powered Beijing parent who dropped off their child in a different place each time. The youngster was then taken to a mystery tutoring location that neither of them had been told about. Yeah. You can see that these companies are doing very well, but what is the actual effect, both psychologically and monetarily, on the families who are participating in these tutoring activities? Mingyu is busier than ever this summer. Like many children in Beijing, the 12-year-old's holiday schedule is jam-packed with extra academic training. 1 English language course, 2 math training programs, a physics camp, plus lessons at 3 tutoring centers. The only difference is that this year, all of these classes are illegal. His parents, who both work in Beijing's finance industry, have managed to keep sending him to a whole range of private classes despite the ban. They're determined to do whatever it takes to help him compete in the capital's brutally competitive education system. Others said that they wanted to sign up their kids for private tutoring, but lacked connections to a training center. Several of these parents, moreover, said their child was falling behind as a result. In Tao's case, that's Mingyu's mum, evading the ban has been straightforward. The majority of the centers where she sends Mingyu and his brother were never shut down in the first place. While the nation's biggest tutoring firms have been forced to drastically scale back their businesses, many smaller players have slipped through the net. Tao has also managed to find replacements for the centers that did get shut down by talking with other parents. She now sends her children to classes with 2 private English tutors, 2 tutoring centers for Chinese reading and writing, and a math Olympiad program. So this shows that where the class divide, the wealth divide, and also the urban-rural divide starts to emerge in the education system. A lot of the people that we're talking about here in big cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, but you don't hear about these training centers really setting up in like rural areas, because at the end of the day, the families can't afford to pay like $60 an hour to get their kid like private English tuition, as well as all of these other programs. There are rich people who are sending their kids to all of these programs and more much earlier. So I read about a 7-year-old who attends 2 English programs, a Chinese course, math lessons, painting, ballet, computer science, and swimming. I know I'm old, but we didn't even have computer science when I was 7. So it's crazy that the parents feel the need to get their kids an earlier and earlier head start in this way. So something else that was mentioned was the fact that online classes are readily available, and the government has also tried to crack down, again not very successfully, on online lessons as well. At the beginning of the summer holiday, several education influencers on Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, posted videos about the importance of summer holidays for children. A viral screenshot shows different influencers stressing the importance of summer holidays for children of every grade. The summer holiday of 2nd grade students is the most terrifying one. An account named Primary Student Parent selling online classes and textbooks wrote him on video. In other videos, he explains why the summer holidays for 4th and 5th grade students are the most terrifying. The anxiety marketing has sparked outrage online, with the related hashtag viewed over 66 million times on Weibo. It even elicited a response from China's state broadcaster, strongly condemning the actions of these so-called education experts. Earlier this month, Douyin launched a special campaign to protect minors throughout the summer, which, among other things, targets anxiety marketing. The announcement came after Douyin deleted 961 videos and banned 81 accounts from posting and selling. The Ministry of Education has said that it forbids training institutions and media from promoting erroneous concepts such as summer holiday is the most terrifying and creating educational anxiety. So like I said at the top of the episode, the main driver behind this anxiety for younger and younger children is the pressure of the Zhongkao exam, or the middle school exam. Students take this exam when they're 15 years old, and they have to take at least Chinese, maths, 1 foreign language, additional subjects like physics, chemistry, and history. Based on the estimated score and referencing previous years' admissions data, students then apply for the list of preferred high schools. Each student is admitted to only 1 school, the highest ranked on their list for which they meet the requirements. Every year, more than 100 students get the same score in a city, therefore a single point can make a huge difference in the ranking, I mean different schools for a student. This causes even greater anxiety, obviously, for people who have poorer backgrounds, particularly migrant families, children of migrant families, who are keen to escape the cycle of poverty. So as the FT puts it, imagine the fear of God that has been put through a lot of families who have spent the last 20 to 30 years escaping life in factories or fields. The difference between the Zhongkao and the Gaokao is pretty huge. So obviously the Gaokao, you can retake it multiple times because it's tertiary education. You can join at any time in your life. The Zhongkao you can only take once when you're 15. And 50% of students go down the mainstream track and 50% go down the vocational route. So this is a huge divider, because even though the law has changed now, previously, only people who got into mainstream education were even allowed to take the Gaokao. So you're already ruling out 50% of the country right off the bat when they're 15 years old. So there are lots of debate as to whether or not the Zhongkao is good, essentially. There are people who argue in its favor because it helps sort of tackle labor shortages in the market. However, a lot of people say that, people's fate shouldn't be decided when they're 15 years old, which is fair enough. Perhaps there's a way to defer the exam until a little bit later on. It's not so much about labor and job prospects as some people try and make it out to be. At the end of the day, it is a social thing. It is a class-based thing. So this is from an article in Sixth Tone. Even though vocational high school graduates have extremely high employment rates of 95%, many of these are considered low-end jobs with little upward mobility. Parents therefore have negative views of vocational education, particularly at the high school level, with students who end up in vocational high schools typically labelled as chashang, or bad student. For a father named Ni from Shanghai, going to a vocational school could be detrimental for his son, who just completed his Zhongkao. Middle school graduates are still too young and mentally immature. Going to a vocational school and ending up in a bad crowd could ruin his life. Going to a regular high school, on the other hand, even if he can't make progress academically, at least he won't become a bad person. Aware of people's negative views of vocational high school, policymakers have rolled out a series of measures to improve public perception. Last year, the government began allowing vocational school students to take the Gaokao and apply for regular undergraduate universities. It's also pushed for enterprises to attach greater importance to vocational skills and upgrade the professional title system for skilled workers. The government's efforts to raise the status of vocational education are also driven by a structural imbalance in China's job market, which has an oversupply of university graduates and an undersupply of skilled personnel with specialized vocational training. According to Chu Jiahui, a normal society should have more graduates employed for their specific vocational skills rather than many graduates with only general knowledge. I think that's the same in a lot of societies at the moment. We are seeing this oversupply of graduates, especially in advanced economies. You get more and more people like me with PhDs that they're not even using because they're not specialized, right? It's like a general knowledge. There's not enough university teaching positions or university professorial positions to absorb all of those PhDs. So you have to re-enter the normal job market anyway, which means that you're basically overqualified. Like technically, in terms of the degrees that you have, you're overqualified for the position, but you don't have actually the specialized knowledge to do a lot of roles. So you have to start from the bottom rung again. But again, it's more about social status than it is actual attainment and applicability to the market. Because of that pressure and the knowledge about the social pressures, children are being pushed to extreme lengths to try and get the best result. The fierce competition and parental expectations are causing huge psychological strains for Zhongkao students. Almost every day for the past year, Shanghai student Zhang Jindong, who is ranked among the top 20 students in his year, spent 17 hours studying to prepare for the Zhongkao. That's 17 hours a day. Sometimes the pressure is from family and teachers, sometimes it's from myself, he says. Zhang asked his mother to buy him sleeping pills because of insomnia. All I can think of are test questions when I lie in bed with my eyes closed. Zhang is not alone. Almost 50% of children in China between 10 and 16 have different degrees of depression, according to data from a study led by the China Institute of Psychology. In late March 2022, 7 teenagers committed suicide in the space of 5 days in Tianjin, with several reportedly due to bad academic performance. Given that there is all this pressure to succeed to the point where people are deciding to end their own lives over their lack of success, if you're a poor person who can't afford private tuition, what are your options? What are you supposed to do to try and get your situation ahead? And the answer to that is something called peidu. You have this phenomenon coming out. This is the article that I read that inspired me to do this episode about peidu motherhood. Peidu literally meaning accompanying education. Again, I got this article from Sixth Tone. I'm just going to read some of it out to you, just like the highlights, but I'll link it down in the description if you want to read the whole thing. It's very, very fascinating. Kind of sad as well, but gives you that really good deep dive overlook into what this is the main problem in China's education system right here, both in terms of pressure, social divide and class divide, and the economy, the effects that it's probably going to have on the economy and other things as well. So this article is based on research conducted by a scientific socialism researcher named Qi Weiwei. Peidu mothers, born primarily in the 80s or 90s, choose to sacrifice friends, social lives, careers, and time for themselves. Their lives revolve entirely around their children. These plans hinge entirely on hope. that their children will get better grades, test into good universities, and break the cycle of poverty. One mother in her 30s, whose husband works decorating jobs in Beijing, lives with her eldest daughter studying at junior high in Yanghu town. She gave up on urban work and returned to rededicate her time to her child full-time. Along with her 4-year-old daughter, the trio live frugally. More than half of the family's income goes on rent and living expenses. The separation of students into general and vocational education has parents worried. Most parents are wary of vocational schools, so they devote themselves to their children in the 3rd year of junior high school to ensure that they get into high school and then university. Typically, their days unfold in small rented apartments near the child's school and involve a hectic schedule of cooking meals, completing the school run, and then after school, carefully studying their child's expression and keeping them company at all times. Some mothers micromanage. For example, she might know it takes 20 minutes to get home from school, and if her child is not home within that time, she will go and look for the teacher. Some mothers are strict because they think they themselves didn't spend enough time at school, so there's a lot of pressure on these children, and they often argue and talk back and feel that they have no freedom. It strains the relationship between parent and child. In conversations with most mothers, Qi Weiwei easily noticed the anxiety and anguish. They underscored the isolation in their daily lives. Far from their village homes, their limited social interaction is primarily with other mothers in the same situation, or else during occasional mahjong games and shopping trips. Most don't have jobs, and their schedules are the opposite of ordinary office workers, making it difficult to integrate. One mother broke down during her story. She talked about the time she couldn't sleep and ended up wandering the streets alone. She had absolutely no life of her own and felt a huge amount of burden. Her husband worked far away and she couldn't talk with him about her day-to-day problems. Some find release in poker rooms or square dancing. Some even develop feelings for others, with divorces not uncommon once the affair becomes known. Chi says that county seats are like an acquaintance society for mothers, with people not strongly connected to one another and less bound by moral and ethical constraints. But not all rural parents feel the need to watch their children carefully. Some, like in richer areas like Guangdong, the countryside is a bit more developed, so it can meet children's educational needs without the parents having to give up work. As for Guangxi and Hainan, parents there perhaps don't attach quite as much importance to education, so the practice of peidou is less prevalent. In Anhui, Qi found that job opportunities for mothers were severely limited. The few that did exist were in the service sector, where wages were low. Incidentally, deep in central and western China, even service sector jobs are scarce, leaving most mothers without any jobs at all. According to Qi, this generation of women is caught between the countryside and the city. They've experienced city life and understand the value of education more than their parents' generation, who are farmers. Yet, they also carry on the tradition of putting family and children first, and so they return home to devote themselves to the next generation. The schools also pose expectations on parents. Elementary and middle school principals in the county capital told Qi that schools would obviously prefer parents to be around. That way teaching is smoother and it helps the children develop. But it only adds to the anxiety. Some schools can provide accommodation, but mothers think that's not good enough. And if other mothers are taking care of their kids, then they should too. More and more families have started focusing on their children earlier on. Mothers used to start in year 3 of senior high, but now begin from year 3 of junior high. Some even start when their child is in elementary school. But does the sacrifice make a difference? As a researcher, Qi Weiwei is pessimistic. For the vast majority of parents, it doesn't help. In the end, only a handful of students end up getting good grades and passing their exams. Other researchers studying the phenomenon have found similar results, especially in villages and towns in China's central and western provinces, for example, of Gansu, Shanxi, and Hubei. It's hard for them to change anything. All they can do is take good care of their children's day-to-day lives, ensuring that they eat and drink well. One mother described the futility of the system. "I hope my child doesn't go off the rails and can navigate the rebellious phase smoothly, if only to finish high school. I'm just doing my best." But with limited educational resources, most Peidu mothers need to face the prospect that their children will get mediocre grades or fail to test into university, no matter their sacrifice. So that's kind of like a bleak look into the sort of lives of poorer women. Not only do they give up everything, but that sacrifice might not even pay off in the end, which is, that's pretty depressing to think about. Just to leave you with one more depressing thing before we wrap up, something that I hadn't actually thought about in this whole process, and that another Sixth Tone article pointed out, is that the cost of paying for your child's extra tuition so that they get ahead and they do well is actually putting families off having more children. So this is also contributing to China's demographic decline. Education should be free and meritocratic, but it's not. And so it's almost like the more middle class you are, the more likely you are to spend as much as possible on your child's education, and the more likely you are to have fewer children as a result. One of the main goals of the double reduction campaign was to prevent parents from spending eye-watering sums on their children's education. Sending kids to multiple tutoring centers had become so common that it was putting off many Chinese couples from having more children. But in some cases, the policy has led to parents like Wu paying even more for private classes than before. Affordable mass-market tutoring services have disappeared, leaving only smaller, more expensive options. Before the ban, Wu was paying just over 20,000 yuan a year, that's like £2,000, to send her daughter to English tutoring. Now she's paying double that for 3-on-1 private classes. Her daughter's extra tuition is now costing the family 10,000 yuan, or around £1,000 a month. For Wu and her husband, the fees are manageable. They have good white-collar jobs, and their combined annual income is over 1 million yuan. But many families aren't so fortunate. The average couple in Beijing earns around a quarter of that. So, concluding thoughts on this issue. Apart from it just being generally interesting, I think for me, it highlights that the issue is how countries sort of set up their education systems and how you measure the success of that education system. Right now in the world, it doesn't matter what political system you have, everyone's economic system is basically running on market capitalism. And so people tend to educate the population in order to drive that economy. And as economies become more advanced, the sectors that earn the most GDP tend to be less and less things like the manufacturing sector, which is what China relied on to grow, and more things like the information sector or consulting, white-collar jobs in things like finance. So as you move more into the white-collar realm, people do look down on vocational roles, which is ridiculous because we can't all be day traders. Someone has to be a plumber, you know? As this episode has showed, it is a social status thing. When you have divisions, like I live in a class-based society because I live in the UK, you have class divisions that are very stark. We still use terms like working class, middle class, upper middle class, and upper class people. It's not necessarily a reflection of how much you earn or how good your job prospects will be, right? So even in this episode, we saw that 95% of vocational students are likely to get a job. Whereas even if you have a degree in China, the unemployment rate is something ridiculous, like it's between 12 and 20%. And like I said earlier, in the UK, you can have a PhD and struggle to get a job. But if you're a builder, you're never wanting for money. We're always building houses because we need them, or, you know, there's always building work to be done. And they earn very, very good money. It's not about money, so to speak. It's about status, both for the individual people and for the economy. You want your economy to look advanced, to look educated, to look rich. And that's sort of the transition that China's going through now. They're putting more and more money into sectors like finance and research and development and science. It makes sense, but obviously this is one of the negative, or this is one of the impacts of that. It depends on whether you see a very competitive education system as necessarily a bad thing. You could say that it helps drive success and improve success rates, but I can't help but think of the individual impact that it has on families and children. And I can't help but think that even if you do get these really highly educated workers, in 15 to 20 years, all you're going to end up with is these like burnt out messes who have used up all of their energy, will flounder, will just give up, and then your economy will go to pot anyway. You're already seeing movements in China like the lying flat movement, where people have just given up, essentially. And yeah, I think we're probably going to see more of that unless the government could come up with very active solutions to these very extant problems. But as usual, I only have complaints and no solutions. So if you have ideas or solution, please leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube, or you can write an email to me if you are listening, and I can incorporate some of your thoughts into the next episode as well. I'd like to start doing that, like taking comments that people have left from previous episodes and sort of like introducing them as topics for discussion. I might also throw some of them in the newsletter as well. So thanks for listening, guys. If you like this episode, please like it on whatever platform that you're listening on. Sinobubble, as I said, also has a newsletter over on Substack of the same name. I'm also on Twitter. I don't use it very often, but I am there. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I will see you again in the next one. Bye.